So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Publishing for Beginners. I'm Kim Barrett. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Physiology, and I'm also a professor at the University of California, San Diego in the United States. And we're very glad that you've joined us. I'd like to welcome also my co-presenter, Professor Vagner Antures, who's going to introduce himself.
Thanks, Kim. I'm going to say in Portuguese. Boa tarde a todos, sejam bem-vindos a esse webinário. E tendo o apoio aqui do Journal of Physiology. Meu nome é Vagner Antures, professor do Departamento de Fisiologia e Biofísica do Instituto de Ciências Biomédicas da USP e atualmente Reviewing Editor do Journal of Physiology. Sejam todos bem-vindos. Eu farei algumas intervenções em alguns momentos em português e no final um resumo e também está aberto para questões tanto em quem quiser fazer em inglês quanto em português. Obrigado. Back to you, Kim.
Thank you very much, Vagner. And I didn't understand everything that Vagner said, but I want to remind the audience that you can ask a question at any point during the presentation, although we'll probably be answering them at the end. But you can do so by typing your question into the Ask a Question box, and you can provide your question either in English or Portuguese, and we will answer in either language. So let's get going. So the presentation this afternoon, an outline is given here. We will talk a little bit about how you choose and define a high-quality journal with some comments about both open access and other models of publishing. The bulk of the presentation will be focused on planning your study with publication in mind and preparing your work for publication. We'll also talk about the peer review process at the Journal of Physiology specifically, and at the very end, I'll make a couple of comments about some advantages of publishing in the Journal of Physiology. And I'm going to hand it over to Vagner to give the outline in Portuguese.
Thanks, Kim. Então, aqui está o resumo, né, dos tópicos que serão abordados nesse webinário. Primeiramente, a professora Kim irá falar sobre a definição de uma revista de alta qualidade, além de outros tipos de acesso e modelos de publicação. O grande objetivo também desse seminário é falar um pouco sobre o planejamento de estudo, objetivando a publicação que alguém tem em mente, como preparar um trabalho para essa publicação, o processo de revisão por pares, do inglês peer review, do Journal of Physiology, e também as vantagens de publicar no Journal of Physiology. Back to you, Kim. Thanks.
Thank you, Vagner. So let's get going, talking about a high-quality journal and how would you choose where to send your work, particularly if this is your first publication that you're thinking about submitting. So the most important consideration is that you want to find a high-quality journal that is read by your target audience, scientists who are interested in your field of study. But there are some other considerations as well. You want to find journals that provide authors with a decent service, both in terms of the response times, how quickly your work will be reviewed, and also the quality of reviews that you will receive. So the feedback that you receive will help you to strengthen your manuscript still further. You want to publish in journals that are well respected, and there are a number of indices that you can consider when making that decision. And you also want to make sure that you don't fall prey to journals that are considered to be predatory. And I'll talk a little bit about what those look like and how you can watch out and avoid those journals. So in choosing the right journal, you want to ask yourself the question about your target audience. Who would be interested in reading this paper? Is it a broadly significant study, or is it better suited to a more narrowly targeted audience. And a part of that consideration is also the importance and the significance of your findings. And sometimes when you've been working on a project for a long time, you might either undersell the importance or get to the point where you oversell the importance. So in this regard, it's important to get input from your colleagues. But no matter what journal you're considering, you really want to decide on the journal before you begin to write, because the way that you write your manuscript will in very much, to a very, very great degree, depend on where you're writing it for. You want to publish in journals that will make your work accessible, and there's a variety of models whereby that occurs. There are widely distributed journals to which libraries hold subscriptions, or sometimes entire countries will have a subscription. Subscription journals come in sort of two flavors. One where you may be asked to publish with the payment of page fees that partially offset the cost of publishing, or other journals like the Journal of Physiology, where the costs of the journal are entirely covered by subscriptions and there are no actual costs to the authors. There are journals also that are so-called hybrid journals, and Journal of Physiology is one of those, which means that you can publish for free, or you can pay a fee which allows your paper to be immediately open access so that anybody can read it. Other papers that are published under the subscription model usually are typically available to everybody after a year of publication. And then there are legitimate, fully open access journals, and the Society journal that we publish, Physiological Reports, is fully open access, and publishing there is supported by payment of an article processing charge to cover the cost of publication. I mentioned the importance of avoiding predatory open access journals, and so we need to define what that is. This is basically an exploitative publishing model that involves charging fees to authors without actually providing editorial and publishing services that would be associated with legitimate journals. So it may actually not even provide any actual peer review whatsoever, and may charge very significant fees. Many times you may receive emails inviting you to submit to journals of this type, and often up till now they've been rather poorly worded. The English is poor. They have unusual phrases in them, such as many of these emails start with the phrase, "Greetings for the day." But I will say that these journals are becoming increasingly sophisticated and will try and trick you into submitting your work. Often they will misrepresent the people who are the editors or the editorial board members. They may be people who have not agreed to serve in this capacity. And most importantly, if you submit your journal, your manuscript to a journal like this, they may hold your manuscript hostage until you pay them a significant sum of money. And you cannot, under those circumstances, submit your work elsewhere. There's a very useful website called Think Check Submit. So it's www.thinkchecksubmit.org. That gives you some pointers to how you can identify these predatory journals. And you'll also find that the librarian in your university likely will be very helpful in helping you sort out legitimate from predatory journals. Some of the indices that you can use to help you decide on which journals are the most widely respected or widely read include the journal impact factor, which is well known. It's a measure of the frequency with which the average article in the journal has been cited. So all things being equal, the higher the journal impact factor, the higher the journal is cited on average. It was originally a tool used by librarians, or intended for librarians, to identify which journals that they would buy or subscribe to. And it often is highly influenced by technicalities that are unrelated to scientific quality of articles. So the deficiencies include the fact that citation distributions are highly skewed, with a small number of papers with large numbers of citations driving the impact factor. The properties of the impact factor depend on the field. Some fields are larger than others and so have more citations. And it's also a composite of different types of articles. So review articles in general receive more citations than articles reporting original research. Some journals choose to manipulate the editorial policy such that the impact factor will be increased. And it really says nothing about the influence of or impact of an individual specific paper. And also, it's a proprietary measure, and the data that are used to calculate the impact factor are not widely available. Nevertheless, people do look at impact factors, and for some institutions and some countries, it's more important. So you need to know what it represents. There has been a consortium of journals and publishers that signed a declaration on research assessment called the San Francisco Declaration, which explicitly said that we should not focus on impact factor as the sole measure of the quality of a given journal or indeed a particular piece of work. Impact factor is not the only metric to consider. There's also the immediacy index, which measures how frequently an average article is cited within the same year as publication, so how quickly articles are cited. For a discipline such as physiology, the citations tend to persist for many years. So cited half-life may be more important than immediacy, and this is the median age of the citations received by a journal during the citation report year. And so higher values suggest that research stands the test of time, and for the Journal of Physiology, the cited half-life is greater than 10 years. And then there's also the eigenfactor score, which rates the total impact of a journal based on the incoming citations, and citations from highly ranked journals are weighted to have a larger contribution. So all things being equal, journals generating higher impact in a field have higher eigenfactor scores. It's also important to consider the services that a journal provides you. So the Journal of Physiology is published by Wiley, along with a number of other society journals. Wiley provides lots of author services that you can find through the journal webpage, helping you to find a journal, prepare, helping you with submission and peer review, whether you need to have particular licenses for your manuscript or to purchase open access, and then publication, and finally promoting your work, which becomes increasingly important. And I'll talk a little more about our approach to that as well at the end. Wiley also provides editing services, which may be important to you if your native language is not English. For a fee, they can provide English language editing and a variety of other services that are available through wileyeditingservices.com. But the bottom line is, how do you get your work published in a good journal? Well, the very first and foremost thing is you need to do a good study. So let's talk about how you plan your study to get published in a good journal. So when planning your study, the most important thing is to keep publication in mind. Think about what you'll need for a good publication when formulating your question and your hypotheses and when designing your experiment. So the overarching process of preparing your work for publication and publishing it is summarized in this diagram. So you can complete your research, you prepare the manuscript, you submit it. The manuscript would then be assigned, in our case, to a senior editor, who would then assign it to a reviewing editor like Professor Antures, and the reviewing editor would then select external reviewers to provide opinions and recommendations on your manuscript. Once that information is available, the reviewing editor makes a recommendation to the senior editor as to the decision, which typically would be either a rejection or revision. It's very unusual to get an acceptance at the time of the first decision, and if you do, that's a cause to close the lab for a day and go and have a big celebration. It's only happened to me once in my career, and having given talks like this many times, it's typically only once for most people who are active scientists. So your paper may be rejected, in which case you would go back and work on preparing the manuscript again for another journal. But a very common outcome is that you will be asked to revise the manuscript based on the reviewer's comments. And then, of course, you can resubmit the paper. It will typically be re-reviewed, sometimes just by the editor, but often by the original reviewers. And then hopefully at that stage you will have your manuscript accepted, and then it will be published. Of course, even after re-review, it's always possible that your manuscript will be rejected at that point, particularly if you were not completely responsive to the concerns of the editor and the reviewers. And so you may have to go back to the drawing board and start on preparing for another journal. So what are some of the common reasons why manuscripts are not accepted for publication? So this slide shows some actual verbatim comments from reviewers and editors. So starting in the top left is, what is missing from the manuscript is a better indication of the background physiology to the study. The manuscript is unacceptable due to methodological problems. The data are not very convincing and are misinterpreted. The study fails to establish a specific mechanism for the vasoactive properties of these metabolites. Mechanism is a very important consideration for the Journal of Physiology. If you have simply described a phenomenon without describing or identifying the mechanism, it's unlikely to be highly recommended for publication in our journal. The next comment, manuscript is pretty weak and there's a publication ethics angle. Reject, the results are preliminary and difficult to interpret. Up in the top right, the manuscript is of interest but misses some of the relevant work undertaken with humans. The study offers only an incremental advance in the field. There are definitely journals that will publish incremental advances, but for Journal of Physiology, we're really looking for something that is a more significant step forward. You need to be aware of the policies of the journal. So here it says the authors use ether, which is grounds for rejection based on our animal ethics policy. So in physiology in particular, obviously animal and human studies are frequently the subject matter of papers that we receive for publication. And so you really need to understand what the policies are of the journal with regard to those aspects. Manuscript does not fall within the scope of the journal, and there is a very low power to detect physiological relevant differences between groups. So keeping a lot of these types of things in mind as you're doing the study will help you to generate a manuscript that is more likely to receive a positive decision. So let's now turn to the question of preparing your work for publication. The overall process, issues to consider before you start to write, authorship, the elements of a journal article, the review and revision process, and tips to enhance your chances of acceptance. And I'll speak first about, what you want to consider before you start to write. And the most important thing about here, in addition to having designed your study well in the first place, is the question of authorship. And you should be aware of the criteria that define who should be the author of a manuscript. And basically it requires everybody to have made some kind of intellectual contribution to the study and who are willing to defend the findings of the manuscript publicly, and also take responsibility if any part of the manuscript is found to be flawed. So moving on to the elements of a journal article. Everyone, I'm sure, in the audience is familiar with the basic structure of most scientific manuscripts. They have an introduction, methods, results, and then the discussion. Now, those four parts of the manuscripts are, it's important to put the right part of the manuscript in the right section so that editors, reviewers, and ultimately readers of the journal will be able to find the information to address the questions that they may have about your work. So the introduction is basically addressing this question. Based on what was known and unknown, why did you do the study? Then in the methods, you address how you did the study. In the results, you answer the question, what did you find? And then finally, in the discussion, what does it mean in the context of an existing body of knowledge? And we're going to take each of these sections in turn, but we're not going to talk about them in this order because it's not actually the easiest way to prepare a manuscript to start at the beginning and finish at the end. So I'm going to recommend an order that you can use to prepare your manuscript. My recommendation is that you start with the methods, particularly if you are beginning in your career and starting out writing manuscripts. The methods is the easiest part for a beginner to write because typically you're the person who's done the experiment and you know the most about the methods. And it's a great way to get going with your manuscript. Methods should be written in the past tense. They are reporting things that you have done in the past. You should check the journal in case they have any specific instructions about the format for the methods. The methods should describe your study design and why you selected the methods that you did. They definitely should precisely identify the models and the reagents that you used, and particularly in the case of animal models, you want a lot of information about the conditions that were used to house the animals, their diet, and so forth. And actually, just in the upcoming issue of the Journal of Physiology, we will be publishing an editorial about what's called the ARRIVE guidelines, which specify information that should be included about animal subjects so that the findings can be understood in that context. You should also indicate approvals for your animal and/or human studies from an appropriate institutional body. And the bottom line about the methods is that they should have enough detail so that others can repeat your work or build on your methods. But you don't need to have every single detail included. You can cite published methods so that you can save some space. But certainly in the Journal of Physiology, we don't have any limit to the number of pages or the number of words, so you can use as much detail as you think is necessary. So once you've written your methods, you can go on to your results section. You want to use a logical order. You do not need to follow the chronology with which you actually did the experiments, because we all know in science that sometimes you do an experiment and you need to really double back to maybe do another control experiment, or it's not a linear process when you're doing the actual study itself, but when you write it down, you want to make a logical story. You should report only the results that are relevant to your hypothesis. This is not your doctoral thesis where you're trying to capture absolutely every experiment that you actually did, but you shouldn't omit data just because they don't support your hypothesis. And you should provide enough interpretation to lead the reader from one experiment to the next. So, for example, in the first experiment, we showed X, and so the next thing we wanted to determine was whether Y happens. But you shouldn't have a lot of lengthy analysis and comparisons in the results section, just enough to tell the story. Having written your results, you are then in a position to, and of course, we don't have time to go into actual sort of display of your data here, but we have had a number of recent editorials that talk about presenting your data in graphical form. But excuse me, having written your results, you would then go on to your discussion. And in the discussion, you want to state the answer to the question that you posed for your study, follow up with supporting evidence, explain your answer so that the reader understands how it fits in the context of what was known before. And I definitely encourage you to discuss the most important conclusions first so that people really get a solid takeaway from your discussion section. And you should write the discussion in the present tense because you are talking about how you feel right now about what your data means. The discussion section is often the hardest part of the manuscript for beginners to write. So don't get discouraged if you need multiple drafts to get the discussion right. But if you stay focused on your question and don't go off into tangents, you will have a nice, crisp end to your story, and people will understand the significance of what you have found. It does not need to be a lengthy piece of the manuscript, typically 4 to 5 pages of double-spaced manuscript. And then finally, when you have the methods, results, and discussion written, then you can go back and write the introduction. Now, in some ways, that seems counterintuitive. Why would you write the first part of the manuscript last? But it's really important to wait till the end, in my opinion, because otherwise the temptation will be to just start writing absolutely everything that you know about a particular topic. The purposes of the introduction are really to get the reader interested in the topic that you've chosen to study and to prepare the reader to understand the paper. You need to keep it short, 1.5 to 2 pages of double-spaced manuscript maximum. And write it last to keep it focused on what you actually did. It should include a very brief review of the pertinent literature, not absolutely everything you know, and it definitely should include either a statement of your hypothesis or your research question, typically at the end of the introduction, so that people then know that how you framed your research. Now, this last point is controversial. Some people believe that you should include a summary of the findings, but in my personal opinion, and that of many other editors, the introduction is not the place to summarize what you found. It's supposed to be your starting point that encourages people to read further into the paper. If you provide a summary, why do they need to read the rest? So here are some tips for success in writing and preparing your manuscript. You definitely want to read the journal instructions, and you also want to avoid being careless. So you want to make sure the spelling is correct, the grammar is correct, and the manuscript is formatted appropriately for the journal if that's required. There are many journals now that allow you to submit your initial manuscript in any format that you choose, but you still want to make sure that the essential elements of the manuscript have all been included. You want to make sure that your references are not only appropriate to the journal, but they're also accurate, and particularly that you have spelled the names correctly of the people that you cite, because you need to remember who your reviewers might be. Often editors will look at your references, particularly the references that you cite in your introduction and discussion, to get ideas about who to ask to review the manuscript. And when a reviewer sees that his or her name has been spelled incorrectly, they're going to think that you've been sloppy in the rest of the manuscript as well, not to mention the experiments themselves. You want to make sure that you upload the correct format for the files that you provide, and especially for the figures. So read the instructions, make sure you know what those should be. And you want to make sure at the end of the electronic submission that the manuscript is in the right format, and the online version is the one that you want the reviewers to see. Now, the submission systems have gotten much more robust in the years since they've been implemented, and it's very rare to have errors introduced into the manuscript during the course of the submission process, but you still want to check. And then finally, make sure that your manuscript was actually received. You should receive an email from the journal confirming receipt. If you don't get that email, figure out by address, contacting the journal directly to make sure that your manuscript was received. When I was previously an editor earlier in my career, I once got a very angry phone call from my boss who was complaining that after 6 months he had not received a manuscript decision. And the first thing I wondered was why he waited 6 months to ask. But then when we looked into the situation, it was basically that a postdoc in his lab had uploaded all the files, but had never pressed the button that said submit the manuscript. So the files were just sitting there, and the journal didn't know that the manuscript was ready to be reviewed. So make sure you press the submit button. I'm going to talk a little bit now about the review process. There we go. At the Journal of Physiology, and as an author, you can expect to receive at least 3 sets of comments on your manuscript, at least 2 of which will come from external reviewers, but then also overarching guidance from the reviewing editor, who will have considered the external reviews and will basically give you information about which are the most important points to address. It's the senior editor who actually issues the decision on your manuscript based on the recommendation of the reviewing editor, which can be acceptance, provisional acceptance, rejection with or without external review, and it may be that you are offered the opportunity to refer your manuscript to our sister journal, Physiological Reports. And then if we're very interested in the subject matter of your manuscript, but we believe that a lot of additional experimentation may be needed, you may be told that your manuscript is rejected, but you may be encouraged to resubmit it after it has been very thoroughly revised. You will know both the name of the senior editor and the reviewing editor who handled your submission if your paper is published, because their names are published along with the paper. But you will always know the name of the senior editor because the decision letter comes with their name. And if you have any concerns about the review process, we actually have a formal appeals process. So what about if your manuscript comes back for revision? If your paper is returned for revision, you are in very good company, because that's what happens to the vast majority of papers, including papers that established scientists submit. It's fine to get mad if your paper is returned for revision, but please don't act on it. Read the reviews, put them in a drawer, and walk away for a day or two if the reviews raise negative emotions. Certainly don't immediately pick up the phone and call the editor and say that the reviewers are idiots. You want to try and understand what the reviewers are really saying. If they didn't understand your work, is it because it wasn't clearly presented in the first place? And often it's helpful to get somebody not involved with the project to take a look at the reviews and your manuscript and help you figure out how to present it more clearly. The reviewers, however, do not accept or reject manuscripts. They're just making a recommendation. So it's the editor who makes the final choice about how many revisions are actually needed. So it's the editor's comments that you really need to pay attention to. Even though the reviewers may have suggested additional experiments, you may need only to do rewrites to satisfy the editor. But in some cases, you will need to do more experiments. So in terms of responding to the reviewers, first of all, of course, complete additional experiments if needed. And then it's really important to address all of the comments in a point-by-point fashion. It's very frustrating both for the editors and the reviewers if you just write a very general statement of what you've done without addressing every question in turn. You want to resist arguing with the reviewers and using passionate language, but if it is truly the right thing to do, to stand firm, you just want to do that, but in a diplomatic way. So if there's a point that the reviewers truly have just gotten wrong or have missed, then stand firm. It's always a good practice to thank the editor and the reviewers for helping you to improve your work in your response to the reviewers, because they have invested time in your paper, and mostly they do that on a completely voluntary basis. So saying thank you goes a long way. And then if you find that you are having a sort of emotional response to the reviews, it's always helpful to get a neutral colleague to look and review your response. So then to summarize some of the best practices that we've talked about, before I turn over to Vagner to give a summary in Portuguese, we would like you to do the study with the paper in mind, to assign authorship appropriately, to tell a story with your paper. Make it easy for people to read and understand why you did the work, what you found, and what it means. Use each section of the paper for its allotted purpose. Choose the right journal. Seek input from colleagues, and remember who the reviewers might be. And so now I'm going to hand it over to Professor Antures to give a summary in Portuguese of the important points.
Thank you, Kim. So, agora eu vou fazer uma breve revisão para vocês de tudo que a professora Barrett falou. Então, tentarei ser um pouco breve aqui no meu resumo. Então, a primeira coisa importante da gente ter em mente é a definição do que é uma revista, um journal de alta qualidade, né? A primeira coisa, o journal tem que ter uma boa reputação. O que é um journal de uma boa reputação? Isso pode estar baseado nos indicadores desse journal, o quanto que esse journal ele está atuando na área. Por exemplo, o Journal of Physiology desde 1878, né? E geralmente os journals que estão ligados a uma sociedade científica, eles têm uma boa reputação. Então esse é um dos pontos principais. Um outro ponto é se o journal ele proporciona aos autores um serviço editorial digno no tempo de resposta, na qualidade das revisões, né? O editorial board, enfim, isso também é um ponto para se levar em consideração. Um outro ponto é identificar se o journal não é uma revista predatória, né? E isso tem que ter muito cuidado. O que significa uma revista predatória? Geralmente são essas revistas de acesso aberto, open access, e eles, na verdade, são modelos de negócios, de publicação acadêmica e de acesso aberto, exploratório, e envolve cobrança de honorários para a publicação dos autores, sem conceder serviços editoriais. A professora Barrett disse que tem um site, né, o www.thinkchecksubmit, que vocês podem checar, né, se aquela revista é ou não uma revista predatória. Geralmente, a abordagem dessas revistas, eles fazem com solicitações de e-mails muito mal redigidos, numa língua pobre, geralmente feitas por robôs, né? Mas eles estão se tornando cada vez mais sofisticados em relação a isso. Então, normalmente quem faz a abordagem são pessoas que se passam por editores ou diretores da revista, né? E há casos mais extremos em que pode se recusar a retornar o seu artigo, né? Ou seja, você submete e eles não retornam, você pede a retratação do artigo, a retirada, e eles não retornam. Então tem que ficar muito atento a isso. Bom, como escolher a revista correta, né? É muito importante ter em mente o público-alvo, quem se interessaria em ler aquele artigo, a importância e o significado dos seus resultados. É sempre importante você buscar opiniões de colegas, né? E decidir sobre a revista que você vai submeter antes de começar a escrever. Tem uma ideia da revista ao qual você gostaria de publicar a partir do momento que você começa a planejar o estudo. Sabe, se a revista, o escopo da revista, né? Por exemplo, no Journal of Physiology, focado em fisiologia e patologia, o caráter exploratório dos mecanismos fisiológicos, uma relevância clínica também é aceita pelo journal. E se não tiver certeza, pode perguntar para o editor. Não há problema nenhum em escrever para o editor, né, nessas situações. E como você consegue publicar seu trabalho numa revista de qualidade, num journal de qualidade? É fazer um bom estudo. E um bom estudo implica em planejamento, né, com o objetivo de publicar esses resultados. Então, sempre pense que você precisará, de uma boa publicação, formular uma pergunta e uma hipótese experimental. Precisa estar fundamentado em teoria, conhecimento existente na literatura, além da metodologia, dos desenhos, dos protocolos experimentais, para poder responder às suas perguntas. O planejamento estatístico também é muito importante. E os elementos essenciais de um artigo, ele podem ser resumidos, né, de acordo com no que foi baseado e no que se conhece ou desconhecido por você que está realizando esse estudo. Isso é a introdução que vai abordar. Como você realizou esse estudo, a parte de metodologia que você vai aplicar para responder suas perguntas, o que se descobriu, que são os resultados, e o que ele significa no contexto do corpo de conhecimento já existente, que é a discussão. A professora Barrett deu uma dica, sempre que for iniciar, eu também dou essa dica, eu compartilho, sempre que iniciar a escrita de um manuscrito, comece pelos métodos, né? Os métodos, escreva sempre com tempo verbal no passado, utilize um formato adequado para a revista, vai lá nas diretrizes da revista e olhe o que a revista pede de formato. É importante descrever o design do estudo e os motivos por que você escolheu aquele método, identificar com precisão os modelos experimentais, o modelo experimental utilizado, os reagentes e assim por diante, né? E você tem que incluir os detalhes suficientes para que as pessoas que vão ler o seu trabalho, elas possam, inclusive, reproduzir. Tá? Então, algumas revistas aceitam citar métodos anteriores para economizar espaço. Mas sempre que for uma metodologia nova, você deve descrever detalhadamente. E sempre ter em mente a aprovação do Comitê de Ética, né, de animais, estudos em animal experimental ou em humanos. Depois, os resultados. Conte uma história sobre esse resultado, né? Você não precisa seguir uma cronologia do seu estudo. Apenas relate os resultados que são relevantes para a sua hipótese. Sempre lembrar que não é sua tese, tá? Então, você não deve descrever tudo, mas também não deve omitir os dados só porque eles não apoiam sua hipótese. Então, forneça uma interpretação suficiente para que o leitor possa entender a sequência dos experimentos. E evitar fazer análises e comparações muito longas. Aí vem a discussão na sequência, né? A discussão, ela indica a resposta a uma pergunta. A sua pergunta, na verdade, né? Então, você tem que dar o segmento na discussão com evidências da literatura, apoiando seus achados ou não, né? Então, você tem que discutir as conclusões mais importantes primeiro, né? E também é importante escrever no tempo verbal presente uma discussão. O que é importante na discussão é não repetir os resultados. Os resultados estão lá. Você tem que discutir esses resultados que você achou no contexto da literatura. Então, associe a hipótese da introdução com as conclusões. Então, você tem que discutir com relevância ampla esses resultados e ficar evitando especulações. Tá? E a introdução, que também é importante, e um ponto que a professora Barrett chama atenção, é que a introdução deve ser curta. Tá? E ela tem dois objetivos principais, a introdução, que é obter o interesse do leitor sobre o assunto e preparar o leitor para entender o artigo. Você deve ter sempre em mente, quando escrever a introdução, qual que é a pergunta que está sendo feita. Qual é a origem da pergunta? E por que se está fazendo essa pergunta? Né? Na opinião da professora Barrett, ela acha que não se deve fazer aquele resumo dos principais achados no último parágrafo da introdução. Né? Não tem problema nenhum fazer, mas ela acha que o conselho dela acho que não é interessante, porque aí você tira um pouco da expectativa também da leitura do artigo. O título e o resumo, né? Esses são os últimos, né, que se faz depois que tudo está pronto. Você tem que ser muito específico para o título e resumo. E você tem que lembrar uma coisa sobre o título e resumo. Eles serão os primeiros a serem lidos pelo editor da revista. Portanto, ele deve ser muito convincente e bem escrito. Né? Então, ele é o cartão de visita para o seu artigo. Se o editor, ao ler o seu título e ler o seu resumo, ele achar interessante, ele dá sequência ao seu trabalho. Senão, ele pode achar que não é de interesse e acaba rejeitando. Um outro ponto é sobre a autoria. Né? É sempre importante decidir os autores o mais cedo possível. Na verdade, de preferência antes de iniciar o projeto. Né? É importante que os autores eles incluam apenas aqueles que fizeram uma contribuição intelectual substancial ao projeto e que possa defender esses dados e conclusões publicamente. É sempre importante lembrar que esses resultados serão de domínio público e você responde por eles. Os autores respondem por eles. Então, tem 4 critérios para a autoria. Né? Primeiro é criar ao menos que o autor ele participe da criação do conteúdo intelectual, com concepção e desenho do trabalho, desenho experimental, design do trabalho, análise de dados e interpretação, né? Ou que esboçou, analisou criticamente ou fez uma revisão do conteúdo intelectual, aprovação da versão final a ser enviada e aceita ser responsável por todos os aspectos do trabalho. Então, esses são os pontos aí importantes para se considerar na autoria. Tá? Então, quando no organograma, quando se submete um trabalho, assim que estiver feito, a conclusão da pesquisa, você prepara o artigo, envia o artigo para o Journal. Esse artigo vai ser feito uma análise, uma atribuição e análise pelo editor em chefe, editor em chief, né? o editor-chefe da revista, que se ele recomendar, ele manda para o editor revisor, ou reviewing editor, que vai também fazer uma leitura e tomar a decisão se esse artigo vai à frente para os revisores, para ele ser avaliado, né? Se ele passar por esse processo de revisão, os revisores mandam a resposta de volta, e aí tem dois caminhos. Uma aceitação, e aí já está publicado, e a professora Kim Barrett disse que na vida dela só aconteceu uma vez, né? Que na minha nunca aconteceu. E geralmente o que acontece é uma rejeição imediata, né? Ou retornar para fazer a revisão. E aí entra no processo de revisão do artigo, né? E algumas dicas para o sucesso é sempre ler as instruções das diretrizes da revista, evitar muitos descuidos como a ortografia, gramática, erros de formatação, certificar sempre que as referências estejam adequadas e precisas. Lembre-se sempre que de quem podem ser os seus revisores. Isso é um ponto importante. Os revisores, geralmente, eles olham na lista de referência para indicar, os editores, perdão, eles olham na lista de referência para indicar os revisores do seu trabalho. Então, é importante você conhecer isso também. O formato adequado, né? E confirme o recebimento. Pode ser que você esqueça de apertar o botão para submeter e ache que está sendo processado e não está. Então, é importante confirmar isso. Já sobre o processo de revisão, se o seu artigo voltar para revisão, e agradeça essa oportunidade de ter o seu artigo revisado e não ser rejeitado de imediato. Então, isso já é um passo, né? É importante não ficar irritado, não se precipitar, né? A gente fica irritado, mas calme, leia com calma, no outro dia você lê de novo, tente entender o que os revisores querem dizer de verdade, porque pense bem, se eles não entenderam o seu trabalho, é porque talvez você não apresentou o trabalho de uma maneira clara, né? E sempre olhe nas dicas e os sinais do editor, quando você recebe essa decisão. Porque o editor, ele é o árbitro final, né? Então, sempre preste atenção no que ele diz respeito à revisão que é necessária. E somente reescrever e responder os comentários dos revisores. Se houver necessidade de fazer mais experimentos, né? Ou você faz ou argumenta muito bem porque não é possível fazer. Ok? As críticas mais comuns de revisores e editores que eles fazem, uma é que o trabalho não está em conformidade com a política de ética da revista. Há uma falha no desenho experimental, por exemplo, uma falta de controle, de um grupo controle apropriado. Falha em avançar suficientemente na área de conhecimento. A estatística inadequada é outro ponto também de críticas. O paper estar puramente descritivo, ou seja, ele não oferece uma ideia mecanística, de mecanismos da sua hipótese. E se ele estiver mal redigido ou fora do escopo da revista. Esses são os outros pontos. E como responder aos revisores? Sempre conclua os experimentos adicionais, se necessário, se eles pedirem, né? E aborde todos os comentários ponto a ponto. Então, sempre, por mais que você esteja tentado, evite essa tentação e resista em elaborar uma resposta fria aos pontos com os quais você discorda. Tem que ser diplomático. Seja firme diplomaticamente, né? Se isso realmente é a coisa certa a se fazer. Se você discorda com o revisor, tá? E agradeça ao editor e aos revisores pela ajuda para melhorar o trabalho, porque eles fizeram um trabalho de revisão, né? E a ideia é melhorar o seu trabalho. e também investiram bastante tempo, né, e a maioria em caráter voluntário. Mesmo assim, se você estiver ainda um pouco de cabeça quente para responder aos revisores, peça a um colega que faça aí uma análise da sua resposta, uma análise imparcial da sua resposta. Isso ajuda muito. Eu acho que era isso que eu tinha para resumir de tudo que foi falado. Agora eu vou voltar com a professora Barrett. Kim, I did my summary. Sorry
Great.
if I took a long time. And back to you now.
No problem. So I'm just going to go very quickly through the last couple of slides so we have time for a few questions. If you want to know what we specifically publish in the Journal of Physiology, on our website you can find the scope statement, and I will not go through the slide, but it will be here for the recording of the webinar. And then some of the advantages of publishing in Journal of Physiology, the leading general journal in the discipline, highest number of citations of any physiology journal. We've been published for almost 150 years, and more than 40 Nobel Prize winners have published with us. We don't have submission fees or page charges, no restriction on the length of the articles. And we work very hard to promote your papers through social media, through editorials, and then we also post video abstracts of selected articles. So if you have any questions after the webinar, you can contact the journal through email, or also our publisher, Sally Howell. And now we're going to turn it over to some questions. So we see some questions coming in the question box. There is one from Dr. Lara Amaral Silva, who is asking about the area of comparative physiology. And it is true that we do not have large numbers of comparative papers. We don't get very many submissions in that area, but we certainly do still welcome comparative physiology papers, particularly studies that use lower vertebrate model organisms, but also more traditional comparative physiology if they really illuminate a broader question of mammalian physiology. So we don't encourage descriptive comparative studies, but we are certainly interested in the lessons that comparative physiology can teach us from mammalian physiology in general. And then Wagner, the next question from Dr. Leandro Borges is in Portuguese, so I will let you answer
Portuguese.
That one.
Yeah, okay, I can answer that. Leandro, você está perguntando aqui, no ato de submissão, o editor leva em consideração o background de publicação do autor correspondente? Se sim, caso o autor correspondente seja um aluno de mestrado ou doutorado com baixa publicação, isso pode prejudicar o julgamento do artigo pelo editor? A resposta, não leva em consideração. Né? Isso não tem nenhum julgamento, nenhum pré-julgamento. Tá? O autor correspondente vai ser aquele que está respondendo naquele momento pela publicação em si. Tá? Então, isso não tem nenhum pré-julgamento em relação a isso. Ok? Yes, any more question? Oh, I don't see any question in Portuguese anymore.
I think there's one other question in Portuguese. But that was asking for the website for the think, check, submit. So I already posted that. There is a question from Dr. Falchetto. What could you say, in your opinion, what is the main problem faced by Brazilians? Is it the language? So occasionally we do see papers that are not written well in English, but I would say that's actually relatively rare. The papers that we receive from Brazil actually fare quite well. You really have some wonderful physiology going on in your country, and I would certainly encourage you to submit. If you do find difficulties writing in English, as I mentioned, there's the editing services, but there are also a lot of English-speaking physiologists who I think would be more than happy to work with you. Dr. Danila Franca asked, can discussion and results topics together? Is it a good idea? So in the Journal of Physiology, we do like those to be two distinct sections of the paper. Again, readers would want to know where to go to find the relative information. But there are certainly some journals that allow you to write those together. That's another reason why you really need to know what journal that you're writing for before you start writing. And then, let's see, and then Dr. Ferreira asked, I'd like to hear your opinion about difficult to publish null results. So negative results are sometimes difficult to publish because there are always potential limitations to any study that may limit the conclusions. However, we certainly would consider a very definitive negative study, and also our sister journal, Physiological Reports, has as an explicit part of its mission and scope the possibility to publish negative results. So they're very interested in papers with negative findings. And then Dr. Tiago Turnes asked, how do you recommend to choose suggested reviewers? So the suggested reviewers, of course, should be people who you know are active in the field of your manuscript and have a solid understanding. We will not use all of your suggested reviewers. Typically, we wouldn't use more than one, and then the editor will also find an independent reviewer. Please don't suggest your friends, although we find very often people who do suggest their friends, they tend to be some of the harshest critics. So it's really just people that you know who are working in the field. We're very eager for you to suggest people who are early career investigators who we may not have on our radar screen as possible reviewers. So people that you've seen speak on the topic at conferences, but it should not be somebody from your own institution or anybody that you have collaborated with directly. So I know that we are at the end of the time, and I think we've answered all the questions that were provided. This webinar will be available again to review and has been recorded. And I very much encourage you to contact either me or Wagner. You can contact us via the journal email address, jphysiol@physsoc.org, which should be still on the screen, I believe. And the only last thing I have to say is thank you so very much for taking the time to join us for this webinar today. I wish you the very best of good fortune with your research and with your manuscript submissions. And we look forward to receiving your submissions and also to meeting many of you in person when the current pandemic situation is behind us and we have the opportunity again to travel to conferences. So thank you very much for your time.
Muito obrigado, pessoal. Só para finalizar, então, essa palestra está disponível no YouTube, tá? Então, quem não conseguiu assistir e quiser retornar, pode assistir novamente. E qualquer contato que vocês quiserem fazer com o editorial board, né? Inclusive com a professora Kim Barrett, fiquem totalmente à vontade, através dos e-mails que estão disponíveis do Journal of Physiology. Mais uma vez, obrigado pela atenção e esperamos aí contar com a presença de vocês numa próxima oportunidade.